Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming today. I'm Diane Halford, and my co-presenter today is Lila Straub, and we're part of a collaborative group of researchers called In Search of Anne Walker. In Search of Anne Walker explores different aspects of Anne Walker's life, and we look in the archives, we look online, we look in various different places, trying to put together as much as her life as we can possibly tell. And on top of that, we also want to create a lasting legacy and honour her through that as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. Today, we're going to be presenting some items that we've looked at in the archives recently, and we're going to put them into context as to how they sit in Anne's life. Of course, we can't search for Anne and not find out things about Anne Lister as well. So there'll be plenty of links to Anne Lister in this talk as well. I'm going to start off handing over to Lila, who's going to begin our presentation.
Okay, so as some of you might be aware, there is a note that Anne Walker wrote to Anne Lister that you can find in miscellaneous files. It's quite difficult to read because Anne Lister scribbled all over it, but we decided to take a closer look and realized it's actually a note that we know of from Anne Lister's diary. Next slide, please. So Anne Lister would go on a round of social call, usually calling at Crownest to see the Walker family, then Cliffhill to see the aunts, and then go to Lightcliff to see William and Eliza Priestley. And on the 17th of August in 1820, she calls at Crownest, and only Anne Walker and her father are at home. So Anne Lister writes in her diary, "Drank tea with Miss Anne Walker and her father. She walked with me to make my to take leave call at Cliffhill. Only Miss Walker at home. Sat there perhaps a quarter hour, and hearing that Mrs. William Priestley was from home dining at Greenroyd, left a message for her, and Mrs. Anne Walker and I walked round by Child's House and Half Edge to Whitehall. Set her home again as far as Lidgate." And we know that at some point during this, Anne and Anne must have talked about making some shifts, like undershirts or undergarments for Anne Lister at Eliza Priestley's school in Lightcliff, because Anne Lister the next day sends a note to that effect to Anne Walker. And then a couple of days later, Anne Walker sends a note back. Next slide. We don't have that note, but we know from the diary that Anne Lister writes, "Sent George over to Crownest this evening with another note to Miss Anne Walker. In answer to hers, received yesterday afternoon, desiring me to send there this evening for the shifts to be crossed at home. She concluded with, believe me, you very affectionate." Some days later, on the 26th of August, Anne sends a second note together with some shifts. Next slide. So Anne Lister writes in her diary, "Note from Miss Anne Walker Crownest, with 4 of my shifts, which she has sent by Sam the horsebreaker. The girl is really very civil, and again signs herself, you're very affectionate. I wonder if she likes me. Mrs. and Miss Walker got home from London on Thursday." So we learn here that the mother, Mrs. Walker, and Elizabeth, Miss Walker, they were not at home when Anne Lister called because they were in London. But what is more interesting is Anne Lister's comment on the way Anne Walker sends her name. And this is actually the note we have. Next slide. So Anne Lister kept this note, but as you can see, she wrote all over it with some Latin book excerpts, and I think there's also one line in Greek, which makes it a bit tricky to read, but Anne Walker's message is still legible. So Anne writes, "My dear Miss Lister, I sent 4 of the chemises, which are the shifts, and the remaining 2 will be finished on Wednesday evening. My mamma and sister arrived at home on Thursday. They left Grandpapa very well. With our united regards to you, Miss Lister, and your sister, believe me, you're very affectionate, Anne Walker." So now we also know why the mother and sister were in London, so they visited the grandfather, John Edwards. We know it's John Edwards because he was the only grandfather alive at that point. And then Anne Lister at the bottom left corner also writes when she received the note. So it says received Saturday, 26th August, 1820. So this also corroborates that it is indeed the note that she's writing about in her diary. And Anne Lister kept the note for a couple of days. Before then, on the 29th, she starts using it for her book notes. So she first starts with the backside where the address is and the empty page, but then gradually over the course of 2 weeks, she fills both sides. Next slide, please. No. But yeah, what makes this note special, I think, is that this note, after receiving this note, it's the first time that Anne Lister writes in the diary, I wonder if, Anne Walker likes me. It's the first time she notices Anne Walker's attention, just the way she signs her note with "You're very affectionate." And it's also the earliest piece of writing we have of Anne Walker. She was only 17 at that time. So yeah, we're quite happy that this is the note, that we have this note. Your turn, Diane.
Okay, so next little bit that we've been looking at is different letters in the archives. You try and look at all kinds of, think outside the box when it comes to the archives. We've got the traditional Shibden Hall letters, we've got the traditional Crow Nest information as well. We try and look out of the box there and try and find things that perhaps might have some kind of mention of Anne in. And as you know, over a year ago, we found out that George Mackay Sutherland had gone at least to Warsaw after the death of Anne Lister to bring back Anne Walker. Now that's evidenced in passport documents from London and in Warsaw that we found in the National Archives a while ago. However, although we know Anne was in Moscow in December 1840, we didn't know if George had gone as far as Moscow because we only had evidence linking him to Warsaw. So what we're looking at here on the screen is a letter dated the 30th of October 1840, and it's from Duncan Forbes Sutherland, who is George Mackay Sutherland's brother, and he's writing to his other brother, their other brother, James Sutherland. It says, yesterday, however, letters arrived from Miss Walker, who has been with a Mrs. Lister on the continent for 18 months, stating the death of the latter in Russian Tartary. And Lucy, that's Duncan Forbes Sutherland's wife, who's been staying with the Sutherlands, writes me that George is to start in 3 days to haul with all haste to Moscow and perhaps to Tiflis to meet her. That's modern day Tbilisi. So what does this letter tell us? Well, it states quite clearly that George was heading to Moscow and was also willing to go all the way to Tbilisi to meet Anne. It also means that Anne must have written to him either from Tbilisi or Tiflis, or let him know at least that she would be in Tbilisi or Tiflis at some point. So it's probably we can conclude from this note that he went all the way to Moscow to pick her up. But also in this letter, there's a couple of other things that we can see. We can see that it adds to a timeline about when Anne Walker wrote to her family about the death of Anne, and also the timescale that George left for the continent. So now we have a new timeline for Anne's return. So as you can see, September the 22nd in 1840, Anne Lister dies in Kutaisi. We now know on the 29th of October, because the day before that letters from Anne Walker arrive at the Sutherlands stating that Anne Lister has died. It says in the letter on the 30th that 3 days later, George is leaving to go to make haste. So we now know that George left on the 2nd of November. But in between there, on the 31st of October, that's when Anne Lister's death notice goes in the Halifax Guardian. So the letters arrive on the 29th of October 1840, and within 2 days, it's in the Halifax Guardian. We then know, obviously, by the 10th of November, George is in London and has got his passport. We know then that he goes to Moscow and meets Anne. We know that Anne was in Moscow at the very latest, the 17th of December, which is when she writes the famous Go On Fearlessly letter from Moscow. And then we know that the 2nd of January 1841, George and Anne get their passports in Warsaw to Paris. Before the 19th of February, which is when we know Anne Walker received a letter and wrote on the letter that she'd received it. She was back in Halifax before the 19th of February 1841. So now we've got a new pieces of information in our timeline to help us tell what happened to Anne and her story after the death of Anne Lister. Back to you, Lila.
Yeah, so another document you can find in those miscellaneous files is a list that Anne Lister made of all the notes she sent to Anne Walker and received from Anne Walker during their courtship in 1832. So the list starts in September and ends in December. Next slide, please. So this is the list. And what is interesting is that Anne Lister also kept all of these notes that Anne Walker sent her. So you can actually find Anne Walker's notes in the archive. So everything that has a green little tick are notes that we have in the archive. There's only one missing, one that has the red cross on Saturday, 17th November. If you check Anne Lister's diary, the note doesn't seem to be of much substance, and Walker just asks her not to send the gardener over. So maybe that note got destroyed or misplaced. I don't know. What you can also see when you go to the actual archive, there are two more notes that Anne Lister didn't add onto her list. So there's an additional note that Anne Walker sent to Anne Lister on the 8th of November and another one on the 13th of November. So we also have these notes. And there's also one that Anne Lister missed on her list that she actually sent to Anne Walker. So we know that from her diary. On the 4th of December, she sends Anne Walker a note asking her how she's doing. In terms of content, the early notes are actually quite entertaining and also flirtatious. So there's one note where Anne Walker writes to Anne Lister about her tenant Collins, who left and took all the cows with him, so she has no milk. And she only realized she has no milk when she was sitting at breakfast. And that's also the reason why Anne Walker then sends her on the 3rd of November a note respecting Collins. And they write about the letterpress, and sending books back and forth and these kind of things. But then the notes gradually become a little bit more emotional and sadder, especially after Mrs. Ainsworth dies, Anne Walker's friend, and her health, she kind of starts spiraling, her health starts declining, and the later letters are all about her health, and she's writing things like she believes her wretchedness is going to bring misery upon Anne Lister and that her own misery is increasing every day in these kind of things. And that's, I think, also the reason that Anne Lister's not really sending any notes to Lydgate in December. It's because she usually went directly to Lydgate. Whenever she would receive a note or something, she would regularly go to Lydgate and also spend the night there. So most of these notes, or all of them actually, are either partially or completely transcribed in Anne Lister's diary. So even if you don't have access to the archive to read Anne Walker's handwriting, you can look at the transcriptions of Anne Lister's diary and at least read the important bits of those notes. But it's still always interesting to compare the original written note by Anne Walker with Anne Lister's transcription. I mean, for the most part, Anne Lister is a good transcriber, but every now and then there's a bit of a typo and maybe even a bit of a Freudian slip. So there's one note where Anne Walker writes about her disconnection with Anne Lister, that she believes it's wrong, and Anne Lister transcribes it in her diary as it's right. And then there's another one. Next slide, please. So this one is actually quite an important note. It's this yes or no purse note where Anne Walker is supposed to give Anne Lister an answer to the proposal. And instead of giving an answer, she sends her this little purse with the yes and the no note in it for Anne Lister to draw. So it's a really important note. Anne Lister completely transcribes it from beginning with the date to the end with signing Anne Walker. And if you read her transcription, one bit she transcribes as follows. I find it impossible to make up my own mind. For the last 12 months, I have lived under circumstances of no common moment. And with my health impaired and with vivid regrets of the past, I feel that I have not the power fairly to exercise my own judgment. But if you read the actual note that Anne Walker wrote, you notice, hold on, there's a word missing. And I mean, Anne Walker's handwriting in the letters, I think it's pretty good and legible, but every now and then there's a word that stumps you. And this is one of these words. And I stared at it for maybe half an hour. Other people in our group looked at it because it might start with a D or an O or an E. There might be an I next to it, or who knows if that's the dot of the I actually. It could end in a T, could end in a double S. So it's tricky. It's really difficult to figure out. My best guess at the moment is it says excitement. So the sentence should say, I have lived under circumstances of no common moment or excitement. But what I love about this is just picturing Anne Lister looking at this word, because she transcribed the whole letter word for word. So she must have stopped at that word for at least a little bit and just go, and then decided to skip it. And there's no trace of it in her transcription. Back to you, Diane.
So we're always, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking for little pieces of a jigsaw in the archives. There's never going to be the massive volumes of Anne Lister's life that's going to tell you the entire of what she was doing every day. So we have to almost rely on breadcrumbs to make a loaf, or jigsaw pieces to make the picture of the jigsaw. And so looking through some solicitor files, we find a couple of documents. We found a couple of letters that are actually in the 1880s documents. These are actually dated from 1854, the week before Anne Walker dies and the day of Anne Walker's death. And they're from Robert Parker, and they're to Dr. John Lister. Now, if you have a look at the letters, you can actually see why they were put in 1880 because the 5 looks very much like an 8, and I understand that completely. Transcribing, as obviously Anne Lister struggled with it as well, it is difficult to do this day as well as it was then. So the 2 letters that we found, these are about the last days of Anne Walker. There is an article, blog on our web about Anne's last days, as there is for Anne's return, and also Lila mentioned Mrs. Ainsworth as well. So there are links on our blogs to, blogs on our website that talk a little bit more in detail about these things we're talking about. But for Anne's last days, the 2 letters we've found, I've got a little quote from both of them. This is from Robert Parker to Dr. John Lister. We currently have a letter from Robert Parker on the 18th of February, but that one was to a family friend. And he says in that letter, she had a fit that he thought so severe it would prove fatal, and that soon. But the one to Dr. John Lister, he writes at 3 p.m. on the 18th of February 1854, he puts, "I have this morning heard that Miss Walker has had 1 or more fits," so that's a little bit of new information perhaps, "and that she is in a most precarious way. I think her end is very," and that's underlined, "near." But one also next to this letter, that were tucked inside another document, was another letter, and this gives us a really, I think, important piece of information. That's the time of Anne Walker's death. We have a letter on the 23rd that talks about fits coming in rapid succession, and that's to Dr. John Lister. And then the next time he writes to him is on the day of her death, on the 20th of February, and he simply says, Miss Walker died this afternoon about 1 o'clock. So now we have a small little crumb that gives us the details of the last days of Anne Walker, and these have been added to our blog, and you can see that on our website. Some more information about where Anne Walker was after the death of Anne Lister. Here we're talking about 1845 in Shibden Hall. Now, in 1845, the railways wanted to come to Shibden. In fact, they wanted to come through Shibden, and they wanted to dig a cutting within 77 yards of the house. And of course, that would have completely ruined the front wall of the terrace might have come down. It would have completely ruined Shibden's beauty at that time and all the work that Anne had put into it. So everybody that was involved in Shibden at that time, so that would be William Gray, who was a trustee of the Shibden estate, Anne Walker's committees, because she at that point had been found to have been on sound mind and wasn't able to make those decisions. So Anne Walker's committees, that was George Mackay Sutherland, and her sister, who died at the end of 1844, she also objected, but also Dr. John Lister, who was the heir at law. So as soon as Anne Walker died, or if she married, then obviously Shibden would pass to him, so he had an interest too. And in his petition to the Railway Committee at the Houses of Parliament in 1845, there is a note that talks about who was living at Shibden Hall in 1845. And we often don't find out information about who's living where unless it's the censuses. And the censuses are run every 10 years. And there was one in 1841, which places Anne at Shibden Hall. And there's one at 1851, which places Anne at Cliff Hill, living with Lydia Fenton and various attendants and coachmen, servants, etc. But here we have a little glimpse of who was living at Shibden Hall in 1845. And in this petition, it states the rooms at Shibden are not large but numerous, and Captain Sutherland and his family, Miss Walker and her attendants, plural, a governess, a tutor, and a large establishment, a large household, are residing there. So I think that's a really lovely little bit of information that we wouldn't get from anywhere else, apart from it's in a legal document. And interestingly to note about this is that one of her attendants, who we know was walking from Captain Sutherland's accounts after he's died, he is paying off two attendants, one attendant and one servant, called the attendant called Joanna O'Brien, and a servant called John Kelly. He pays them as working for him, but also to note that they're also noted in the 1851 census as living with Anne Walker at Cliff Hill. And so this would mean that John Kelly was the coachman, and he was also the person that was the informant of Anne Walker's death. He appears on her death certificate. And Joanna O'Brien is down as the attendant to Miss Walker in the 1851 census. So we're now beginning to see that these people were with her for a long period of time, and one was her attendant for at least 6 years. So next information is also about Shibden Hall, but in 1847. I've mentioned Lydia Fenton living with Anne Walker over at Cliff Hill in 1851 on the census as a housekeeper. Lydia Fenton, and we have a blog about her on our website, was a lifelong friend of the Walker sisters and the daughter of the Vicar of Lightcliffe, Robert Wilkinson. We've found letters in the archive, and I'll quote them in a second, that show that Lydia had in fact not only lived at Cliff Hill, but after the death of Captain Sutherland in 1847, she had moved into Shibden Hall with Anne Walker as well. So the letters read as such. The first letter we found was a letter from the new Mrs. Sutherland, so Mary Sutherland, Mary Haig, who married George Sutherland after the death of Elizabeth. She writes to Lydia, and she says it's addressed to Lydia Fenton at Shibden Hall, and it says, "I hope Miss Walker goes on well, which I am sure will add to your comfort at Shibden Hall." So that mentions that she's obviously at Shibden Hall at that point. And then later on in 1848, Lydia Fenton herself writes to Robert Parker, the solicitor, from Cliff Hill, where she's now living with Anne. On the 1st of April, she writes, "I send you the key of the tower at Shibden Hall, and have desired Kelly," that's John Kelly, the coachman, "to give you the keys of the house." So now we know that Lydia Fenton was also living at Shibden Hall with Anne by November 1847, which was the date of the Mrs. Sutherland note. Again, more crumbs to make the loaf. This is a letter that we found. Oops, going backwards. I need to go backwards 1 second. This is a letter that we found in the archive, again, in the solicitor's letters. And this is actually a letter from George Mackay Sutherland to Robert Parker, which is talking about Lydia Fenton again. And it's talking about Lydia visiting Elizabeth Sutherland in November 1844. Now, Elizabeth Sutherland died at the end of December 1844. So she went down to London. At the time, George Mackay Sutherland and Elizabeth, Anne Walker, and the children were living at Abbey Lodge in Merton, Surrey, which is now part of Greater London. And so she had travelled down and arrived early in the morning, I think about 7 o'clock in the morning, to go and see Elizabeth Sutherland. And that's what the letter is about. However, on the back of the letter, George has written a note to Robert Parker stating the following. Miss Atkinson, who never had given Miss Walker and Anne Walker any cause of offence, indeed has not seen her since 1834, went into her room to see her yesterday. She made a fearful row and turned her out of her room in a second, saying she would never acknowledge anyone except the gentlemen of the Herald's College. And the force with which she shut the door shook the house, imprecating the vengeance of God against all for the insult offered to the memory of her deceased friend. She absolutely rejoices in her sister's sickness and has no doubt that all the rest of her relatives will be similarly punished. Now, when we read that obviously, is quite a dramatic and statements that he's making there. And let's just talk about it a little bit. Miss Atkinson here is one of the two cousins that she was regularly in contact with up until is mentioned quite often in the diaries as well as in other correspondence that we've seen. We're not sure which Miss Atkinson it was. The gentlemen of the Herald's College are the people that were deciding her coat of arms. And we know that she wrote to them quite frequently. There's another comment made that she will only write to them from a couple of years, from about a year previously to that. And the memory of her deceased friend here, she's talking about Anne Lister. So obviously Anne feels that aggrieved about something that the Atkinsons have done in the memory of Anne Lister. It's bearing in mind that just after this, and certainly by April 1845, Anne was living in a private asylum in Hammersmith before she moved in April 1845. She moved back to Shibden with George and the family. So this might give us some insight into her state of mind, but also we have to remember that the caveat has been written by George Mackay Sutherland, who's under, whose wife is also dying, and his daughter is also very poorly at this time. But we thought it was important that we shared this with you so that you can see that there's many facets to what happened to Anne after Anne Lister died. And this, I think, just brings out one person's opinion on what was going on with Anne Walker at that time. So we've got a few more little items of interest. That this one is about travel notes that we found in the miscellaneous files of the Shibden archive, written by Anne Lister. And these were identified and transcribed by Doriana Shirola, who's part of In Search of Anne Walker. So we found some travel notes written by Anne Lister in 1813, and they document her travels from Bath to Dorset with Isabella Norcliffe. And it includes a sketch of Glastonbury Tor. Now, what's interesting about those is that they are mentioned several times. These notes are mentioned several times by Anne in her later diaries, and they are now available for you to look at if you ever visit the archive. So now we've got an extra early, that's quite an early travel notes of Anne Lister's that you can look at, and they've been transcribed as well. And one other thing that I just wanted to end on, because, we're all about searching for Anne. And interestingly, this is a well-known note, but it just struck me as really quite lovely. There's a note in the Shibden Hall letters from Anne Lister, and Anne is copying a letter on behalf of Anne. So Anne has written to Mariana Lawton, and as you know, she copies a lot of her letters, sometimes in a diary, sometimes on pieces of paper, and Anne is copying this letter on her behalf. And in this letter, Anne refers to Anne Walker as Adney twice. And so Adney is written twice in Anne's handwriting. And what I really just wanted to do is show you that picture there, because I think that's a lovely little thing to see Anne writing her own nickname Adney. And that's probably one of my most favourite things I've actually seen in the archive. So that ends our presentation today of all the little bits and pieces that we found. But before we move on to questions, just wanted to mention our legacy part of In Search of Anne Walker. Every year, and we have done since 2020, we do a fundraising for a food bank in Anne Walker's name. And there's reasons we do that. In Anne Walker's will, she left £10, the annual sum of £10 to be distributed among the poor of township of Lightcliff. It's on Christmas Day every year. And as somebody that wants to, as an organisation that wants to keep Anne's memory alive, we thought it'd be excellent to launch our own fundraising. It was an official charity, registered with the Charity Commission over here, and it kind of ended around about 1970s when the amount that it could pay out was so nominal that it actually wasn't worth paying it out anymore. But we resurrected it in our own little way. It's not an official charity, it's just a fundraise that we do. And we fundraise for Brighouse Central Food Bank. That's one of the closest food banks to where Anne was. It also serves the Lightcliff area. In 2020, we raised £1,300 for Wyke Food Bank, which is just down the road. In 2021, we raised £1,686. And last year, and we really started off with a small amount last year, but you absolutely blew us away. We raised £2,661. That's helping over 40 families in the Lightcliff area. And that's going to be happening again this year. We launch it round about 24th of November until Christmas Eve. Please keep an eye out on our social media. And if you don't follow us already, please do follow us. Take a look at our website. And oh, that's gone. There we are. Contact information. Sorry, my mouse is not playing today. That's where you can find us. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, on the web, and there's our email if you need it as well. So now we've got some time for some questions.
So let me see, there's a couple of them. One of the question is, how do you approach looking for these needles crumbs in the giant haystacks?
That's a really interesting question. So what I do is I, first of all, look at the most obvious. And then I try to look at things around that, because it's not unusual, like the letters from Parker to Dr. John Lister about the last days of Anne Walker, for dates to be mixed up. You know, it really does look like an 8 instead of a 5. And if you transcribe a lot, you can see that, you know, Anne Walker's 8s are kind of slanted and on the side, and that can be mistaken for different numbers. So it's easy. So I try to look around those areas too. And then secondly, I try to think outside the box. So we try to look at things connected to Anne in some way that we know have got some connection. So we've looked at letters and diaries of Lady Vere Cameron, for example, because we know that she was connected to Anne Lister, but we also know that she wrote to Anne Walker after the death of Anne Lister, because that's in a letter that Anne Walker has sent. So we've looked in there in case she mentions, she doesn't, but in case she mentions Anne Walker, nothing that we've seen that mentions her. She does mention Anne Lister a few times, obviously, and there's some letters of hers in that collection as well, of Anne Lister's. So we kind of do the obvious, move slightly either side of it to see if we can find, and then just laterally think of who is connected in any way. We also do look at things that are unconnected, so contemporaries, so things like diaries of people that were around at the same time, or letters belonging to people that were around at the same time. And sometimes, you know, we've got thousands and thousands of documents, and probably 80% of those probably don't even mention Anne Walker, but we have to look to find.
Yeah, so it kind of goes into the next question, actually. How much material that you know of is still out there to sift through that might give more interesting finds? and connected that. Like, have you an idea of other people's correspondence out there that Anne might be mentioned in, such as the Sutherland families or Cabell State?
Yeah, so we find, so the first part of that question would be that, I mean, we don't know what is out there. We go to lots of different archives, look in lots of different files, you know, and there will be stuff that's not even in archives. They'll be in people's attics. You know, they don't realize what they're sitting on and how important
Basement
it is.
of Cliff Hill.
Pardon? What was
Basement
that,
of Cliff Hill, like
yeah,
the basement in Cliff Hill, somewhere that we can't
anywhere.
access.
Could be anywhere. Yes, you know, basically any of these places, there could be something, and you know, there will be a lot of stuff belonging to Anne Walker out there that might not have a name on, so we'll never necessarily be able to prove its provenance, or anybody doesn't even know what they're looking at. So it's hard to say. And what was the second part, Lila? Sorry.
Kind of similar to what you already answered, like there might be other people's correspondence that, you know, mention Anne, like the Sutherlands, which yes.
So
it's
they
a
might
matter of finding it, right?
Absolutely, but it's a matter of finding it. So that's why we focus on going kind of out towards the people that might have been contemporaries of hers, because they might have some kind of mention.
I would always, like, I keep saying that I would love to find Aunt Anne Walker's letters, but I don't think they still exist. But I don't know. But we know she mentioned her in letters to Elizabeth, and you know they had a correspondence. So that would be fantastic to find at some point. But one question wants us to clarify that note about imprecating the vengeance of God. Who is writing what or who's saying what to whom? So just to quickly clarify, Miss Atkinson. So George is saying that Miss Atkinson called on Anne Walker, but Anne Walker kicked her out, basically. So Anne Walker is the one that is acting inappropriately. And Anne Walker is saying that she is happy that Elizabeth and basically her whole family is sick. So this refers to her sister. She's being quite, spiteful. Or, I mean, I would also say, you know, it must have been horrible to watch your sister die. So I don't know how much of that is also just grief talking and frustration and everything that, And they must, I think there's also evidence that at some point they must have had a bit of a falling out, because when Anne Walker that whole lunacy commission starts, there's letters of Elizabeth where she says that her coming to Halifax is going to be useless, and Walker is not even wanting to see her. So there must have happened, like something must have happened there. We just don't know.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Is there still time for more? Hold on.
Yeah, time for one.
So there was one more question, I think, for In Search of Anne Walker, if we are planning to make a book for like general public and enthusiasts about Anne Walker one day. I think that was the last question.
We've got a tremendous amount of material that we need to go through, you know, and we continually look for different ways of putting that information out there, and we need to go through, make sure we've got everything right, making sure we're not missing anything obvious or misinterpreted anything particular strongly, and so so there's always different ways that we're looking to put our information out there for everybody, and you know, we try to make everything open access. So at the moment, most of this stuff is available on our website.
There's the booklet that we put out, the booklet that kind of brings up a good summary of Anne Walker at the moment. Absolutely. And we update that as well. Like if you find important information, we can update that always.
Yeah, and the booklet is currently available in English, Portuguese, French, help me out here, Italian, sorry, and also it will be coming out in German very shortly. And I think
in terms of questions,
I think that's everything. And if anybody wants it in Dutch, just contact us, and absolutely, we can give you the booklet to transcribe, and we can put it into the booklet format, and then put that out as well. So we're open to anybody that feels they could translate it into a different language for us, because the more people that know about Anne Walker, the better, in our opinion. I just want to thank everybody for taking time out of your Sunday to come and speak to us and listen to us talk. And thank you so much for listening.
Thanks.